The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a metal valley filled with noise and movement. Thousands of alien beings sat in rows that rose up toward the ceiling, their voices mixing together in a sound that hurt human ears. Ambassador Jake Morrison stood at the center of it all, his hands folded behind his back as he listened to the charges being read against his species. Speaker Veltar towered over the podium, his crystal body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the floor. The tall alien had been waiting for this moment for years, and Jake could hear the joy in his voice as he spoke the words that would change everything. The Council has found humanity guilty of excessive violence during the Rigel incident, Veltar announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive room. They have shown disregard for proper diplomatic procedures on 12 separate occasions. Most serious of all, they completely destroyed the Scourge fleet at Proxima Gate, showing no mercy to an enemy that had already begun to surrender. Jake almost laughed at that last part. The Scourge did not surrender. They had never surrendered in the 1,000 years since first contact. They consumed entire worlds, turning living beings into twisted creatures that served their hive mind. When the human fleet had cornered them at Proxima Gate, there had been no white flags or peace offerings. There had only been the choice between complete victory or the death of 3 billion colonists. The humans had chosen victory. They had chosen to save lives rather than follow the Council's rules about proportional response and minimum necessary force. Now they were being punished for it. The vote has been taken, Veltar continued, and Jake could hear the satisfaction in his harmonic voice. 847 species have voted in favor of the motion. Only 3 have voted against it. The Council hereby strips Earth of its voting rights and reduces humanity to protectorate status. The chamber erupted in cheers from some species and shocked silence from others. Jake noticed that the Centaurians, who had always been friendly to humans, looked upset. The Rigelians, whose colonies the humans had saved from the Scourge, appeared to be arguing among themselves, but the majority of the Council seemed pleased with the decision. Furthermore, Veltar raised his voice above the noise, all human military vessels will be equipped with Council-approved restraint protocols. No human commander will be allowed to use weapons above Class 3 without direct authorization from a Council supervisor. All human ships will carry Council observers to ensure compliance with these new regulations. Jake felt his jaw tighten. Restraint protocols meant their weapons would be locked down, their targeting systems limited, their ability to protect innocent lives reduced to whatever the Council deemed acceptable. It meant watching people die because some alien bureaucrat thought saving them might look too aggressive. Behind him, Captain Lisa Park shifted slightly. Jake knew she was thinking the same thing he was. 30 years of service to the Council. 30 years of keeping the peace in the Outer Rim territories while the core worlds grew fat and rich. 30 years of human blood spilled to protect species that now voted to put them in chains. The human delegation will now respond to these measures, Veltar said. Gesturing toward Jake with one of his crystal arms, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small datapad. The chamber fell quiet as he walked slowly to the speaker's podium. He could feel thousands of alien eyes watching him, waiting to see how humanity would accept their new place in the galaxy. He set the datapad on the podium with a soft click that somehow seemed to echo in the vast space. Ambassador Morrison, Veltar said, confusion creeping into his voice. What is the meaning of this device? Jake looked up at the crystal being who had just destroyed his species' future in the galaxy. It contains resignation letters, he said quietly. All of them, every human in Council service. The chamber began to buzz with confused voices. Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. Captain Rodriguez of the Outer Rim Patrol Fleet has resigned. Admiral Smith of the Border Defense Force has resigned. Commander Johnson of the Deep Space Monitoring Stations has resigned. Every human officer, every ship captain, every station commander, every peacekeeper, every diplomatic aide, every technical specialist. He paused, letting the words sink in. We are all resigning, effective immediately. The buzz became a roar as the implications hit the assembled delegates. Jake had to raise his voice to be heard over the noise. All human vessels are being recalled to Sol System. All human personnel are withdrawing from Council territory. All protection agreements between Earth and Council member species are hereby terminated. All defense pacts are void. All peacekeeping operations are suspended. Valtar's crystal form flickered with agitation. You cannot do this. The Outer Rim territories need protection. The trade routes require patrol. The border stations must be maintained. Jake smiled for the first time that day. You just voted to put restraint collars on us. You called us too violent for civilized company. You stripped us of our rights and tried to turn us into your attack dogs. He picked up the data pad. Instead, we are walking away. The chamber exploded into chaos. Delegates were shouting, some in panic, others in anger. The Altarian representative was screaming about the Korthic raiders. The vegan ambassador was demanding that Earth be forced to honor its commitments. The Centaurian delegate was trying to call for a new vote. Jake turned and walked toward the exit, Captain Park falling into step beside him. Behind them, the greatest political body in the galaxy was tearing itself apart with fear and rage. Think they will try to stop us? Park asked quietly. Jake glanced back at the panicking aliens. They can try. As they reached the chamber doors, Jake heard Valtar's voice rising above the chaos, calling for order, demanding that Earth reconsider. Insisting that they had duties and obligations that could not be abandoned, Jake did not look back. Humanity had served the Council faithfully for 3 decades. They had bled for species that despised them, died for worlds that mocked them, and sacrificed their own interests for the good of galactic civilization. Now it was time to go home. The great doors of the Council chamber closed behind them with a sound like thunder. In the corridor beyond, human staff members were already packing up their offices, loading equipment onto transport ships, preparing for the journey back to Earth. The withdrawal had begun. The recall order reached every corner of human space within 6 hours of Ambassador Morrison's announcement. From the Outer Rim territories to the core world defense stations, the message was simple and clear. All human personnel were to return to Earth immediately. Captain Roy Martinez stood on the bridge of Kepler Station, watching his crew strip the control panels of their most sensitive equipment. The border station had been humanity's farthest outpost for 15 years, a lonely sentinel watching for threats from the dark space beyond Council territory. Now it would become just another abandoned structure floating in the void. Sir, the Council liaison is requesting another meeting. Lieutenant Barnes reported from the communications station. Roy almost smiled. Commander Nelthara had been demanding explanations for the past 4 hours, her feathers ruffling with increasing agitation as she realized what was happening. The proud Altarian had always treated the human crew like hired muscle, useful for fighting but too stupid for real decision-making. "Tell her I'm busy," Roy said, watching his people load the last of the quantum torpedoes onto the transport ships. "If she wants to know what's happening, she can watch the news feeds." Nelthara appeared on the main screen anyway, her blue feathers standing on end with fury. "Captain Martinez, you cannot simply abandon this position. The Korthic raiders will overrun this entire sector within days of your departure." Roy turned to face the screen, his expression calm. "Should have thought of that before you voted to put shock collars on us. We never voted for any such thing. The Council simply decided that human military forces needed better oversight." "Same thing," Roy replied. He gestured toward the evacuation ships docked at the station. "We've been watching your back for 15 years. We've died for your people, bled for your colonies, and missed our children's birthdays to keep your trade routes safe, and how do you repay us? By calling us too violent and stripping away our rights." Nelthara's feathers flattened slightly. The Council was concerned about human methods. The destruction of the Scourge fleet was seen as excessive. "Excessive?" Roy's voice rose for the first time. "Those things had just consumed 2 colonies. They were heading for a 3rd. We stopped them the only way possible, and you call it excessive? There are rules of war, Captain. Standards of civilized behavior." Roy laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tell that to the 3 billion people who are still alive because we broke your rules." The evacuation continued around them as they spoke. Roy watched his chief engineer, Sergeant Collins, supervise the removal of the station's main computer core. The man had spent 10 years maintaining the complex systems that kept Kepler Station operational. Now he was dismantling his life's work with the same careful attention to detail. "Where will you go?" Nelthara asked, her voice smaller now. "Home," Roy said simply. "Earth, where we should have stayed in the first place." The Altarian commander tried one last time. The Council could reconsider. If humanity were to request a formal review of the decision? "No," Roy cut her off. "We're done asking for your permission. We're done begging for your respect. We're done pretending that you see us as equals." He moved closer to the screen. "You wanted us to be your servants. Instead, we're walking away." Similar scenes played out across 12 sectors as the Great Withdrawal began. On the mining world of Tau Ceti Prime, Colonel Sam Hughes led his troops away from the dilithium mines they had protected for a decade. The native Centaurians begged them to stay, offering higher pay, better living conditions, anything to keep the human garrison in place. "We're going home," Hughes told the desperate alien officials. "Find someone else to fight your battles." At the Vega Junction, one of the galaxy's busiest trade crossings, Captain Nina Foster found herself surrounded by 3 Council warships. The local commander, a pompous Rigelian named Kexvar, demanded that she surrender her ship's weapons before departing. Council Regulation 847 requires all military vessels to be disarmed before leaving their assigned patrol zones. Kexvar announced over the com channel. Nina looked at her weapons officer, Lieutenant Price, who simply shrugged. "Sir, our orders are to return to Earth with all equipment intact." "Then you are in violation of Council law," Kexvar replied. Nina considered this for a moment, then activated her ship's targeting systems. The 3 Council vessels immediately detected the weapons lock and began backing away. "This is Captain Foster of the Earthship Vigilant," she broadcast on all frequencies. "I am returning to my home system with my crew and my weapons. Anyone who tries to stop me will discover why the Council thought we were too violent for civilized company." The Council ships moved aside. Admiral Betty Ross coordinated the massive operation from her flagship, the Defiance. The veteran officer had spent 30 years building the human fleet into the most effective fighting force in the galaxy. Now she was bringing it all home. "Status report," she called to her operations officer. Commander Pete Davis consulted his displays. 73% of our personnel are en route to Earth. The outer rim stations are being evacuated as we speak. We should have everyone home within the week. Any resistance from the Council? Some posturing, but no actual interference. They're too busy panicking to organize a proper response. Ross nodded. The Council's own military forces were scattered across the galaxy, designed more for show than for actual fighting. They had grown comfortable letting humans do the hard work while they enjoyed the benefits of peace and prosperity. "What about the equipment?" Ross asked. "Engineering teams are following Protocol 7. Anything we can't take with us is being destroyed." Protocol 7 was the Scorched Earth directive that Ross had hoped never to use. Rather than leave advanced human technology for the Council to study and copy, her people were systematically destroying research facilities, manufacturing plants and weapons stockpiles. The destruction was thorough and efficient. On the research station at Alpha Centauri, Dr. Kevin Wright watched his team dismantle the quantum computer that had taken 5 years to build. The device was capable of calculations that had revolutionized space travel, but it would not be left behind for the Council to exploit. "It seems like such a waste," said Dr. Patricia Kelly, Wright's assistant. "Not a waste," Wright replied as he personally destroyed the computer's core components. "Insurance. We built this with our own hands and our own minds. If the Council wants the technology, they can develop it themselves." As the final transport ships departed from the outer rim, they left behind empty stations and abandoned facilities. The galaxy's most effective military force was going home, taking with them decades of experience, advanced technology, and the Hard-won knowledge of how to keep the peace in a dangerous universe. The Council would learn soon enough what that peace had cost and what it meant to lose the guardians who had provided it. Behind them, the darkness began to gather. 3 months after the last human ship crossed into Sol System, the galaxy began to burn. The first attack came at dawn on the mining world of Kepler 442b, where the Korthic raiders struck with a fury that had been building for years, without human patrol ships to stop them. The pirates swept through the outer rim like a plague of locusts. Captain Zexelin of the Altarian Defense Force watched his sensors with growing horror as the raider fleet approached his position. 12 ships against his single patrol vessel, and he knew his crew was about to die. The Altarians had never been warriors, preferring to let humans handle the dangerous work while they focused on trade and diplomacy. Send a distress signal, he ordered his communications officer. Request immediate assistance from the nearest human patrol. The young officer looked up from his station with confusion. Sir, there are no human patrols in this sector. They all went home 3 months ago. Zexelin felt his blood turn cold. He had forgotten. In 30 years of service, he had never faced a real battle without human backup. Now he was alone with a crew trained for ceremonial duties, facing an enemy that had been held back only by the threat of human retaliation. The raiders destroyed his ship in 4 minutes. Similar disasters struck across the galaxy as the Council's own forces discovered they could not fill the gap left by humanity's departure. The vegan Second Fleet, considered one of the Council's elite units, was wiped out by pirates at the Rigel Crossing. The Centaurian Home Guard abandoned 3 colonies after a single skirmish with raiders who would have run from a human patrol. Ship. In the Great Council Chamber, Speaker Veltar stood before an emergency session that had been called to address the crisis. The crystal being's normally bright form was dim with stress as he read the casualty reports that seemed to grow longer each day. 17 colonies have been overrun, he announced to the assembled delegates. 6 major trade routes have been severed. The Rigel sector is completely cut off from the core worlds. Ambassador Quextile of the Hegemony Worlds rose from his seat, his multiple arms gesturing wildly. Where are our fleets? Where are our defenders? We have thousands of ships spread across the galaxy. Redeploying, Veltar replied weakly. The logistics of covering territory previously patrolled by human forces are complex. Complex was putting it mildly. The Council's military had been designed for peacekeeping and ceremonial duties, not the brutal reality of frontier warfare. Their ships were beautiful, their crews well-trained in diplomacy and protocol, but they had no experience with the kind of vicious combat that humans had handled for decades. When the First Council battle group encountered the main Korthak fleet at Epsilon Eridani, they approached the engagement like a formal duel. The raiders, who had learned their trade fighting desperate colonists and merchant vessels, showed no such restraint. The Council ships were destroyed in minutes, their crews unable to adapt to an enemy that cared nothing for the rules of civilized warfare. On Earth, President Helen Carter watched the galactic news feeds with cold satisfaction. The woman who had authorized Jake Morrison's final ultimatum felt no sympathy for the Council's struggles. She had warned them what would happen if they tried to chain humanity like attack dogs. They made their choice, she told her advisors during the morning briefing. Now they get to live with the consequences. The isolation of Earth had not been without cost. Humanity had lost access to rare minerals, alien technologies, and the vast galactic marketplace that had enriched their civilization, but they had also gained something more valuable, the freedom to determine their own destiny among the stars. Dr. Greg Thompson, head of Earth's new independent research division, was already making breakthroughs that would have been impossible under Council oversight. Without their technology restrictions, he explained to President Carter, we've improved our quantum drive efficiency by 40%. Our new ship designs are faster, more heavily armed, and completely autonomous. The research restrictions had been one of the Council's most insulting policies. Human scientists were forbidden from working on certain projects deemed too dangerous or aggressive. Weapons research was limited to approved designs. Even medical research was subject to council approval if it might have military applications. Now, free from those constraints, human innovation was advancing at a pace that amazed even the scientists themselves. New alloys made their ships stronger. Improved power systems made them faster. Advanced targeting computers made them deadlier than anything the galaxy had seen. The Council's attempts to communicate with Earth were met with stony silence. Ambassador Morrison had returned to his farm in Montana, refusing all contact with his former colleagues. When desperate council representatives tried to reach him, they found only an automated message. Earth is a closed system. Return to council space immediately. Meanwhile, the crisis deepened across the galaxy. The Scourge, the nightmare aliens that humans had barely defeated at Proxima Gate, began probing the Outer Rim defenses again. Their scout ships, biomechanical horrors that could adapt to any weapon, penetrated deep into council space before being detected. Without human early warning systems, the first sign of Scourge activity was usually the complete silence from an entire star system. The pleasure world of Risa Nova, home to 3 billion beings from dozens of species, went dark without even sending a distress signal. When the Council's rapid response fleet arrived at Risa Nova, they found empty cities and the distinctive biomechanical structures that marked Scourge occupation. The planet's population had been converted into twisted hybrid creatures that served the hive mind, their bodies transformed into living weapons. Commander Yelenash of the Response Fleet stared at the tactical display with growing horror. How many of those things are down there? Approximately 3 billion, sir, his scanner operator replied. All showing signs of Scourge conversion, the fleet retreated without firing a shot. What could they do against an enemy that turned entire populations into weapons? The humans had faced the Scourge before and won, but they had used tactics that the Council considered too extreme, too violent, too inhuman. Now the Council was learning why those tactics had been necessary. Veltar's emergency broadcast reached every corner of the galaxy within hours of the Risa Nova disaster. The Scourge have returned, he announced, his voice cracking with desperation. All member species are called upon to contribute to our mutual defense. This is not a request but a requirement for survival. But the strongest defenders were no longer listening. They had gone home to a small yellow star where they waited behind defensive screens that no council ship could penetrate. The galaxy burned, and humanity watched from afar. 6 months after the withdrawal, the first council delegation arrived at the edge of Sol System like beggars approaching a castle gate. Their ship, the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Light, was immediately intercepted by a human patrol cruiser that appeared out of nowhere with weapons already charged. This is Earth Defense Force Vessel Vigilant, Captain Alex Turner's voice crackled across the communication channel. You are entering restricted space. State your business and prepare to be escorted out. Ambassador Crystal, who had replaced 3 of his predecessors after they suffered nervous breakdowns, tried to maintain his dignity despite the desperate circumstances that had brought him here. We come seeking audience with Earth's leadership. The galaxy faces a crisis that threatens all intelligent life. Turner's response was cold and immediate. Earth is a closed system. Return to council space immediately or you will be fired upon. Please! Crystal's voice broke slightly as he thought of the burning worlds behind him. The Scourge have taken 12 systems. Our forces cannot stop them. We need humanity's help. There was a long pause before Turner responded, and when he did, his voice carried no sympathy at all. That sounds like a council problem. You made it clear that humanity was too violent for civilized company. Fix it yourselves. The delegation was escorted to the system's edge and sent away with their tails between their legs. Similar scenes played out as more council ships arrived, each carrying increasingly desperate pleas. The proud species that had once looked down on humanity as primitive warmongers were now reduced to begging for help from the very beings they had tried to chain. The second delegation included Speaker Veltar himself, his crystal form cracked and dimmed by stress. He brought with him recordings of the Scourge attacks, hoping that images of the destruction might move human hearts where words had failed. "Captain Turner," Valtar's transmission was humble, almost pleading. "I bring evidence of the threat we face. Surely humanity cannot stand by and watch genocide unfold across the galaxy." Turner's reply was swift and brutal. "We watched you vote to strip our rights. We watched you call us barbarians. We watched you try to put restraint collars on our ships. Now you want us to risk our lives for species that despise us?" "We were wrong," Valtar admitted, the words coming out like broken glass. "We underestimated the threats you faced, the decisions you had to make. We see that now." "Too late," Turner said simply. "Go home." On Earth, the debate raged within the government halls and military command centers. General Dan Mitchell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, argued for intervention during heated meetings with President Carter and her cabinet. "Whatever our differences with the Council, we cannot let the scourge consume the galaxy," Mitchell insisted, his fist pounding the conference table. "Those things don't stop. If they take the core worlds, they'll come for us eventually." President Carter remained unmoved by his arguments. "They called us warmongers and barbarians. They stripped us of our rights and tried to chain us like animals. Now they want us to die for them?" Secretary of Defense Patricia Hayes supported the president's position. "Our intelligence suggests the Council has plenty of ships and resources. They just lack the will to use them properly. Maybe facing real consequences will teach them what we've always known about the galaxy." The turning point came when the Scourge fleet arrived at Centauri Prime, home to 4 billion Centaurians who had always maintained friendly relations with humanity. The planet's desperate final transmission showed the biomechanical horrors descending from orbit, converting the population into twisted hybrid creatures that served the hive mind. Dr. Angela Ross, Admiral Ross's daughter and a leading xenobiologist, broke down watching the footage during a government briefing. The images showed Centaurian children being dragged into conversion chambers, their screams echoing across the communication channels until the signal went dead. "We have to do something," she pleaded with the assembled officials, tears streaming down her face. "These aren't just numbers on a casualty report. They're people we've worked with, fought alongside, shared meals with. The Centaurians never voted against us. They tried to help." Admiral Betty Ross, now serving as Earth's defense minister, felt the weight of command as he watched his daughter's pain. The military was ready to deploy at a moment's notice, but the political will remained uncertain. Could they stand by and watch genocide unfold simply because the Council had hurt their feelings? The decision came from an unexpected source. A group of human colonies that had been established outside Council space, led by Governor Matt Cooper of New Texas, announced they would act independently of Earth's government. "Earth may have pulled back from galactic affairs," Cooper declared during a broadcast that reached every human settlement, "but we won't abandon our friends to these monsters. The colonial fleet is deploying to assist any species willing to accept our help." The colonial fleet was small but well-armed, crewed by volunteers who had chosen to remain in space rather than return to Earth. As they prepared to depart for the war zone, they received an unexpected message from Admiral Ross himself. "Colonial vessels, this is Admiral Ross. You are not authorized to engage in independent military action." There was a pause that seemed to last forever. "However, the Earth Defense Force will be conducting training exercises in the same region. Try not to get in our way." The message was perfectly clear to anyone who understood military speak. Humanity was going back to war, but they would do it on their own terms. Governor Cooper smiled as he received the transmission. "Understood, Admiral. We'll try to stay out of your training area." Within hours, the recall orders went out to human reserve units across Earth and the inner colonies. Veterans who had served on the frontier came out of retirement, their faces grim with purpose. The shipyards that had been quiet for months suddenly roared to life as new vessels rolled off the production lines, but these were not the same forces that had withdrawn 8 months earlier. These ships bore different names, carried improved weapons, and flew under Earth's flag rather than the Council's banner. The restraint protocols were gone, the Council observers were absent, and the rules of engagement had been written by humans for human purposes. Captain Steve Harrison, recently promoted to command the heavy cruiser Payback, received his orders with satisfaction. "No quarter, no mercy," the briefing stated. "Show them what happens when they threaten our galaxy." As the human fleet prepared to depart, Ambassador Morrison came out of retirement for one final message to the Council. His transmission was brief and to the point. "You wanted to chain us. You called us too violent. You tried to teach us restraint." His weathered face filled the screen, and his eyes held no warmth at all. "Now you get to see what we look like when the chains come off." The human return to galactic warfare was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Gone were the restraint protocols, the Council oversight, and the political limitations that had held humanity back for decades. This was humanity unbound, fighting not for the Council's approval but for the survival of civilization itself. Admiral Betty Ross led the reformed human expeditionary fleet into battle, but these were not the same forces that had withdrawn 8 months earlier. The new ships were sleeker, deadlier, and bore names that spoke of humanity's changed attitude toward galactic politics. Retribution, Nemesis, Unforgiving, and Reckoning. The first engagement came at the Kepler 442 system, where a massive Scourge fleet was in the process of converting the population of 3 billion beings. Captain Steve Harrison commanded the vanguard aboard the heavy cruiser Payback, and his approach was direct and absolutely brutal. "All ships, weapons free," Harrison's voice echoed across the fleet channels with cold determination. "No quarter, no mercy. Show them what happens when they threaten our galaxy." The battle lasted exactly 47 minutes and became a masterpiece of human, military innovation unleashed from all restrictions. The new quantum torpedoes punched through Scourge bio-armor like it was tissue paper. The enhanced plasma cannons burned through their adaptive shielding without effort. But it was the new nanite swarm weapons that truly terrified the enemy, dissolving their biomechanical ships from within while they screamed across all frequencies. The Scourge fleet was completely annihilated. Not a single enemy vessel escaped. To warn others of what was coming, news of the victory spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire, carried by merchant ships and refugee vessels that had witnessed the battle from a safe distance. The Council, watching from their emergency command center on the heavily fortified world of Sanctuary, could barely believe the tactical displays their sensors had recorded. Commander Yexahal, their chief military advisor, studied the battle recordings with growing amazement and fear. "How is this possible?" he asked the assembled Council leadership. "These weapons, these tactics, they are decades ahead of anything we have seen from human forces." The answer came from intercepted human communications that their intelligence services had managed to decode. Without Council restrictions, humanity had been free to develop their full military potential for the first time in 30 years. The weapons they had used were prototypes that had been banned under Council law as too destructive and inhumane for civilized warfare. The humans no longer cared about fighting fair or following the rules of war. They cared only about winning. Completely and permanently. Captain Karen Walsh led the second wave of attacks, her battle group equipped with the new Extinction-class battleships. These massive vessels were designed for one purpose: the complete eradication of enemy forces without any possibility of survival or escape. When she engaged the Scourge fleet at Vega, her tactics were simple and absolutely terrifying to witness. "Target their command nodes first," she ordered her gunners with clinical precision. "Then their production facilities. Then their support vessels. Then everything else that moves." The battle was broadcast live across the galaxy by news drones that maintained a safe distance from the combat zone. Alien populations watched in a mixture of terror and admiration as the human fleet moved with mechanical precision, systematically, destroying every Scourge vessel and installation in the system. No prisoners were taken. No mercy was shown. No quarter was given. The Scourge, for the first time in their recorded history spanning 1,000 years, began to retreat from human forces. Their hive mind had calculated that continued engagement would result in total extinction, something they had never experienced before. but humanity was far from finished with their ancient enemy. Admiral Ross had learned hard lessons from the first war against the Scourge decades earlier. Letting them escape only meant they would return stronger, with new adaptations and better defenses. This time, he intended to end the threat permanently and completely. "Begin Phase 2 of operations," he ordered from his command ship. "Hunt down every Scourge vessel in the galaxy. Follow them to their home systems if necessary. Track down every last hiding place. This threat ends now and forever." The human fleet split into dozens of task forces, each led by captains who had been waiting their entire careers for permission to fight a real war without restrictions. Captain Bill Rodriguez took his ships into the Outer Rim territories, pursuing fleeing Scourge forces through asteroid fields and nebulae where they thought they could hide. Captain Linda Hayes led her squadron into the Galactic core, where Scourge infiltrators had been hiding among civilian populations for years, slowly converting isolated communities. Her orders were clear: find them all and destroy them completely. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity waged total war against the ancient threat that had haunted civilized space for millennia. The Council, still reeling from their own massive losses, found themselves reduced to spectators watching a campaign of annihilation that dwarfed anything they had imagined possible. The human fleet moved through space like a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. Star systems that had been infected with Scourge presence were systematically cleansed. Entire Scourge colonies were wiped from existence. Their biomechanical production facilities were reduced to atoms. When Captain Rodriguez cornered the last major Scourge fleet in the Horsehead Nebula, the enemy tried one final desperate gambit. They attempted to negotiate, offering information about other threats in exchange for their survival. Rodriguez's response was transmitted across all frequencies for the galaxy to hear. The time for negotiation ended when you started converting children into weapons. Prepare to be destroyed. The final battle lasted 6 hours as the Scourge threw everything they had at the human fleet. Biomechanical dreadnoughts that had been growing in the nebula for centuries emerged to fight. Weapon systems that could tear apart planets were brought online. The very space around them writhed with living technology designed for destruction. The humans won anyway. When the last Scourge facility was destroyed 3 weeks later, the galaxy was forever changed. The threat that had haunted civilized space for over 1,000 years was gone, completely eradicated by a species that the Council had deemed too aggressive for civilized governance. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was truly safe from the Scourge. The human fleet returned to Sol System victorious, but the galaxy they left behind was forever changed. The Council, their authority shattered by their complete inability to protect their own worlds, struggled to maintain order as member species, openly questioned their leadership and demanded new arrangements. President Helen Carter addressed the nation from the Oval Office, her words broadcast throughout human space and intercepted by every intelligence service in the galaxy. "The Scourge threat has been eliminated," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "But let no one mistake this for a return to the old ways." Humanity fought not for the Council's approval, but because it was the right thing to do. The Council's response was swift and desperately humble. A new delegation arrived at Sol System within days, this one led by Speaker Veltar himself. The once proud crystal being had aged visibly during the crisis, his form cracked and dimmed by the stress of watching his civilization nearly collapse. "Admiral Ross," Veltar's transmission was broadcast on all frequencies, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic privacy. "We humbly request permission to enter Sol System. We must speak with Earth's leadership about the future of galactic civilization." Admiral Ross, now effectively Earth's military leader and most powerful voice in government, considered the request carefully. The man who had once served under Council authority now held their fate in his hands. "You have 1 hour," Ross finally replied. "No weapons, no escorts, no threats, no demands. Just you and whatever dignity you have left." The meeting took place aboard the space station Unity, humanity's newest orbital facility that had been built during the isolation period. Veltar faced not just Admiral Ross but President Carter, Ambassador Morrison, who had come out of retirement for this historic moment, and the entire human leadership. The chamber was simple and functional, lacking the grand displays of power that characterized council facilities. The humans sat at a plain metal table, their expressions neutral but their eyes hard with memory of past insults. "We were wrong," Veltar began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We underestimated not just your military capabilities but your absolute necessity for galactic survival. The galaxy needs humanity." President Carter's response was as cold as space itself. The galaxy had humanity. You voted to chain us like animals and strip away our rights. You called us too violent while we died protecting your worlds. We offer complete restoration of your previous status, Veltar continued desperately. Full voting privileges, territorial autonomy, unlimited military authority, priority resource allocation. Name your terms and we will agree to them. Ambassador. Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face showing the years of frustration and anger. Our terms are simple and non-negotiable. Earth remains completely independent. We will provide security services to those who request them and can afford our prices, but we will never again rejoin the Council. We will not submit to your authority. Or anyone else's. Then what will you be? Veltar asked, confusion evident in his harmonic voice. Admiral Ross answered with quiet confidence. We will be what we have always been, humanity, but this time we will be humanity unleashed and unrestrained. The new arrangement was formalized in the Treaty of Seoul, a document that fundamentally restructured galactic civilization. Humanity would operate as an independent power, providing security services to those who requested them and could meet their price. The Council would maintain its political authority over willing member species, but would never again claim jurisdiction over human space or activities. The galaxy settled into its new reality with surprising speed. Human patrol fleets returned to the Outer Rim territories, but now they flew under Earth's flag rather than the Council's banner. The protection they provided came with a substantial price, but it was a price that most species gladly paid after. Experiencing life without human guardians, Captain Joe Murphy commanded one of the new patrol fleets, operating out of the recently established Firebase Alpha in the Tau Ceti system. His ships were crewed by volunteers who had chosen to remain in galactic service, but now they answered only to Earth and fought under human rules of engagement. "Status report," Murphy called to his operations officer during the morning briefing. "Lieutenant." Maria Santos consulted her displays with satisfaction. "All sectors are secure, sir." The Korthic raiders attempted to probe our defenses yesterday, but they withdrew immediately when they detected our sensor nets and weapon signatures. Murphy nodded with grim satisfaction. Word had spread quickly throughout the criminal underworld about what happened to those who attacked human-protected space. The raiders had learned that tangling with unleashed humanity was a form of suicide. Meanwhile, on Earth, a new generation of leaders was emerging. Young people who had grown up during the isolation period, who had never known the Council's authority or restrictions. They looked to the stars not with the old humanity's desire for acceptance, but with a conqueror's eye for opportunity and expansion. Dr. Greg Thompson, whose research had revolutionized human military technology during the isolation, was already working on the next generation of innovations. "We have proven we can defend ourselves and others," he told President Carter during a cabinet meeting. "Now we need to decide what kind of civilization we want to build among the stars." The answer came from the Outer Rim colonies, led by Governor Matt Cooper and the other colonial leaders who had never lost their frontier spirit. New worlds were being terraformed at an unprecedented rate. New trade routes were being established with species that had never been part of the Council system. New alliances were being forged based on mutual respect rather than political necessity. "We do not need to join anyone else's club," Cooper declared during a conference of colonial governors. "We have the strength to build our own civilization, one that respects human values and human independence." The galaxy had indeed learned to fear humanity, but more importantly, it had learned to respect them. The species that had once been dismissed as primitive warmongers were now recognized as the ultimate guardians of civilized space, the final arbiters of galactic security. As Admiral Ross looked out at the stars from his command deck, he reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this point. Humanity had walked away from the Council's table when offered chains instead of equality. They had forced the galaxy to confront its own weakness and dependence. The Council had learned fear, but they had also learned respect. And in the vast darkness between the stars, where new threats might someday emerge, humanity waited with weapons ready and eyes unblinking, the self-appointed guardians of a galaxy that finally understood the true cost of their protection. The war was over, the reckoning was complete. Humanity had come home as conquerors.